While a severe thunderstorm is raging over the airport of Toronto, an Air France Airbus A340 is attempting to land. Just seconds after touchdown, the plane overruns the runway end at great speed and the fire starts. What happened here, and did anyone survive? Find out with me today as we take a look at the story of Air France 358. Subscribe so you won't miss any future aviation videos. Welcome to Airspace. In the afternoon of August 2nd, 2005, Air France 358, operated with an Airbus A340, was cruising in the skies of northern Canada after having crossed the Atlantic Ocean during the last few hours. The 6-year-old aircraft held 297 passengers and 12 crew on that date. Shortly before descent, the pilots obtained the newest weather information for Toronto and saw that most likely they would encounter thunderstorms at some point during the approach. This was expected. The pilots had even ordered 3 additional tons of fuel to be loaded, just to be prepared for the worst in case they would have to go around or divert. Meanwhile, the weather at the airport deteriorated more and more, and lightning strikes were observed. Runway 23 was closed due to the proximity to the bad weather coming in from the north, and runway 24 right was closed as well, since the instrument landing system's antennas were struck by lightning a few minutes before and were now inoperative. Only runway 24 left remained for the landing of Air France 358, the shortest runway at Toronto's airport, offering just 2,740 meters or 9,000 feet. The crew accepted the approach to this runway and briefed the procedures, however, they never mentioned the rather short runway length. 8 minutes before landing, lightning struck the weather station responsible for runway 24 left, knocking it offline. The tower now had no way of reporting wind speeds to the landing planes. Still, aircraft were approaching the airport, and 2 even landed successfully, reporting wind measured by onboard equipment of coming from the northeast at 15 to 20 knots and the braking efficiency that other crews described as being poor. Given all these circumstances, the crew concluded that the conditions were unfavorable yet manageable for a landing and continued their approach through increasingly terrible weather. All was well until a point just a few seconds before landing at 300 feet above the ground. At this point, the first officer disconnected the autopilot and the automatic thrust control and started to hand-fly the aircraft. He was faced with crosswinds and strong turbulence. When he noted that the airspeed was dropping, he increased power to the engines to almost 80% of their maximum available thrust. The plane now floated above the runway and finally touched down in severe rainfall with bad visibility. Passengers started clapping at this point after they believed the pilot flying had just performed a rather smooth landing in very challenging conditions. But the aircraft was hurling towards the runway end at 140 knots at this point and was slowing down just very sluggishly. At the end of the runway, it still had high speed, went onto soft ground and burst through the airport fence, leapt over an access road and came to rest next to a small creek. A fire started almost immediately and an evacuation was started. The outcome of this was astounding, but more on that later. First, let's figure out what happened to the A340 exactly. Everything was turbulent but normal while the aircraft was on approach to runway 24 left. But the weather was deteriorating rapidly. The investigation showed that there were 6 lightning strikes in the area of the runway head of runway 24 left, while the aircraft was at only 400 feet, and another 14 lightning strikes left and right of the runway just before touchdown of Air France 358. This must have been scary to see from the flight deck, and it is amazing that it seems that the A340 was not struck by lightning even once. Only at this point, shortly before landing, did the pilots mention the runway length. Both of them were familiar with the airport, so the investigation assumes that they considered the runway length to be acceptable. The tower now cleared the flight to land, but only gave the pilots an approximate wind measurement that the previous landing aircraft had reported. Supposedly, the wind was considered to be moderate to strong coming from the front right. At this point, 300 feet above the ground, the first officer switched off the autopilot and the automatic thrust management system. He intended to fly the last few seconds, all by hand. But almost immediately the airspeed started to drop, since the wind shifted from the front right to the tail right. The first officer responded quickly by applying almost 80% of thrust on the engines. Quite a lot, and most likely too much, as the investigation concluded. The airplane started to accelerate and deviated above the glide slope. It crossed the runway threshold at 90 feet instead of the required 50 feet. This might not sound like much, but in the last few seconds before landing, every single foot counts. From this high and fast position, flying in a tailwind, the chances for a safe landing became slimmer and slimmer. At this moment, the plane entered a heavy downpour and the visibility reduced to almost zero, according to reports by the pilots. It became now very difficult to judge where in respect to the runway the plane was. In such a situation, the safest course of action is usually to just go around and try again in 15 minutes, or divert and land somewhere else. But the pilots believed they could no longer do that since there were thunderstorms ahead and all around of them, and they had believed themselves to be committed to land. They had effectively maneuvered themselves into a dead end. The plane eventually touched down smoothly and far left to the center line, 1,200 meters down the runway, which is only 2,700 meters long. A normal touchdown should usually be achieved between 300 and 600 meters down the runway, so this landing was way too long. Roughly 1,500 meters now remained to bring the huge plane to a halt. Immediately, the first officer applied brakes but only selected reverse thrust 13 seconds after touchdown, probably due to being startled. It developed its full effect only 18 seconds after touchdown. Now, the reality of the situation became evident to the pilots. The plane slowed down only very slowly. The runway was covered with a layer of water at the time of landing, which rendered the runway in a state known as contaminated. Using the landing distance calculation tools for the A340, considering the factors at hand at the time of the accident, contaminated runway state, 185 tons weight and a 10 knots tailwind, the required landing distance was determined by the investigators to be over 3,200 meters, more than double the distance that Air France 358 had left. Had the pilots considered this, they would have not attempted the landing. The plane left the runway end, still traveling at 80 knots, that is 150 km per hour or 90 miles per hour. It broke through the runway fence, leapt over an airport access road and came to rest on the bank of a creek after 15 horrifying seconds. After the plane came to a stop, fire started when the remaining fuel in the tanks caught fire. The head steward ran to the flight deck to inform the captain, who then immediately ordered an evacuation, but the respective button did not work anymore. Therefore, the evacuation was initiated by just shouting orders, and passengers complied. Not all emergency exits could be used since some were engulfed by fire, and at others, the emergency slides did not deploy. In the cockpit, the captain's seat was unhinged by the forces of the crash, and he received serious back injuries and could not perform his duties. Instead, the first officer assisted the captain in evacuating and remained on board until every last passenger had left the broken airplane. Standing in the pouring rain outside the A340, passengers now witnessed how it was consumed by fire. Miraculously, everyone made it out alive. After the crash, several policies had to be changed. For example, Air France didn't require its pilot to regularly calculate landing distances, a fact that is rather baffling to me. Also, Air France was urged to change its policy that only the captain may order a go-around. Up to that point, the first officer was not authorized to make such a call. The investigation board believed that this may lead to delayed or omitted go-arounds in hazardous situations. The captain required extensive physiotherapy after the accident and retired 3 years early, having never flown again after the crash. This is the nightmare of every pilot, ending one's career in a disaster. The first officer was suspended for 3 months. I hope you liked this week's video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. See you next week.